The following Truth Barista podcast is a High Beam Ministry production.
Marx believed that workers, specifically those who did manual labor, were exploited by capitalists, the people who owned, as Marx put it, the means of production, specifically factories, but who did very little physical labor themselves. Only a workers' revolution, Marx wrote in Das Kapital, could correct this injustice. What would that revolution look like? Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels spelled it out point by point in the Communist Manifesto. It included the abolition of property and inheritance, and the centralization of credit, communication, and transport in the hands of the state, and a lot more along the same lines. In other words, the state owns and controls pretty much everything. Wherever Marx's ideas were practiced, life got worse. Not by a little, but by a lot. There is not a single exception to this rule. Not the Soviet Union, not Eastern Europe, not China, not North Korea, not Vietnam, not Cuba, not Venezuela, not Bolivia, not Zimbabwe. Wherever Marxism goes, economic collapse, terror, and famine follow. So, if cataclysmic failure, meaning terrible human suffering, is the inevitable legacy of Marxism, why do so many people, and now especially young people, defend it?
Welcome to the Erzatz Coffee Shop. This is Jay, your Truth Barista, and I'm serving up a steamy cup of God's truth for the average Joe. You can catch me and this podcast on my websites, truthbarista.com, all one word, truthbarista.com, and highbeamministry.com. That's HIGHBEAM ministry.com, as in car high beam. We're shining the light of God's truth on the road ahead.
Truth Barista, this is so exciting. Last week I was so enamored by all your knowledge historically.
Shucks.
Of Marxism. But you know, you never talked about Mrs. Marx.
Because I don't even know if he was married. I didn't do that much study.
Well, you know, the interesting thing is, since he didn't like
the family.
Yeah. I thought, wow, he must have been married to a...
Yeah, okay. Anyway, no, really, I just did a cursory examination. There's all sorts of really good information from PragerU.com and his YouTube videos and other sources that really boil down what Marxism is. And I'm sure there's a book out there, Marxism for Dummies, kind of a thing. But I'm really kind of concerned. No, I'm not kind of. I'm very concerned about Christians who are throwing their lot in with groups that don't realize that those groups have their roots in Marxism. In fact, some of those groups are professed Marxists. So if you know they're professed Marxists, then you look at their statement of faith or what they're about stuff, and you go, there's the Marxism right there, but it's couched in slightly different language because, we don't want to be like them Soviets over there, them Stalinist, Maoist guys. We don't want to be the Marxists. But they're still carrying Marxist principles. They're still doing things according to Marxism. They're still trying to create, through human means and human strength and human design, a utopia on earth that only God can create, because they're trying to change the outside where God is trying to change the inside. Remember when we talked about that on Subdue and Rule a couple of weeks ago?
Yes, exactly.
That the two views of humanity, and I think we need to revisit this for a second, the two view of people between those who are conservative and those who are liberal, okay? And we're talking just in general right-left understanding. The conservative believes people are inwardly fallen, that we are not intrinsically good. And the only way you can fix that is you have to change people on the inside, because that's what makes them, air quotes, bad. So you have to change them on the inside. When they're changed on the inside, then the outside will follow, and they'll be good. They'll act and behave well. Okay, on the left side, you have people who believe that mankind is basically good. What makes them act poorly are the things on the outside. So if you want people to shape up, you just need to change things on the outside, their environment, their circumstances. Once you do that, they'll naturally fall into utopian behavior. Well, this is classic. This is Marxism. Marx said the reason people are bad is because they don't have the material things they need. Those bad people over there have the material things they need, which is kind of interesting to me. If they're bad, but they have all the material things they need, then why aren't they good? Oh, we'll just forget that. We'll just move. Okay. So what we need to do is for the oppressed, if we just improve their outward circumstances, we'll have utopia on earth. That's the difference. Marx is looking at society through a lens of power. Who has power and who doesn't? And he did it in an economic way. So you had the oppressor and the oppressed, the business owner and the worker. You had the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. How has this morphed into society today? The critical theory, it's also known as critical race theory, but that kind of narrows it down a little bit. Critical theory is in essence a reworked Marxism. It is Marxism that is not just economic, it's applied to all parts of culture.
Okay, let me stop you there. Critical theory, if you could boil it down to one or two words, what would it be?
Critical theory is oppressor versus oppressed.
So it's about power.
It's the same thing as Marxism, only it's not just applied to economics and the material world, it is applied to all of life. In fact, as people live, we produce culture. Culture comes from how people live.
Right.
People in other parts of the world have a different culture because they live differently than we do. So culture is produced. Okay, so I'd like to share an article with you. I did some more research on this cultural theory thing. This is what it says in the article. Marx viewed society through the lens of power. Economically, the producers and production owners had power, the workers had none. So strip the producers of their power, give it to the workers, and everybody will be equal, hence utopia. Shoulder to shoulder, just like Eden. This is the humanistic way to a utopia, not God's utopia called his kingdom. It's a human kingdom, a humanistic, materially focused kingdom, not God-focused and spiritual material kingdom. Critical theory expands the scope, but it keeps the focus on the power. So here's the quote. Each individual is seen either as an oppressed or as an oppressor, depending on their race, class, gender, sexuality, or any number of other categories. Oppressed groups are subjugated not by physical force or even overt discrimination, but through the exercise of hegemonic, or I'm in charge, power. The ability of dominant groups to impose their norms, values, and expectations on society as a whole, relegating other groups to a subordinate position. In other words, critical theory, it selects targets, those who are perceived or actually in power, and they say, because you're in power, you have the levers of power, then everybody else who's different from you obviously don't have the levers of power, so we need to bring you down in order to raise them up. And of course, the Lone Rangers raise their hands and they say, oh, we'll help you do that. You just put us in a position of political power and we'll make it work for you. And that's how Marxism is actually a part of critical theory. It's the oppressed versus the oppressor. Now, not everything about critical theory is wrong, and that may sound kind of strange to you. In fact, your eyes just got really big talking to you. Critical theory people say that race is not important to a person's worth. And you know something? That's true, okay? Race is a social construct. It's been created, not really rooted in human nature or biology. I read a really fascinating article on race that we talked about a couple of months ago. They say there is more diversity within a particular race than there are between races. So you look at the black race, air quotes, across the world, there's more diversity there than there is between black and white. So really, it's a construct. In fact, there are some black people who are called white, and there are some white people who have passed themselves off as black. It's ridiculous. Okay, so critical theory, in a sense, has that right. There is no difference between races. And by the way, there is such a thing as hegemonic power or power based on those in control, right? So you look at politics today. You look at the police. Are the police in control?
Yes, they are.
Do they exercise control?
Absolutely.
Okay, so some people look at the police as the oppressors and the man on the street as the oppressed.
So that's why they all want to defund the police and have some community policing group without guns and really without a whole lot of authority.
And there you go. Number one, that is Marxist thinking. And number two, that is changing the externals to try to get people to act better. And number three, when you do that, human nature takes over and crime is skyrocketing in the Twin Cities, Minnesota.
So, question, Truth Barista.
Yep.
Since you've brought it out, why aren't we that are opposing Marxism, why are we talking about these groups and this defund the police stuff as a Marxist move? Is it because we're not knowledgeable enough about it? We don't see the correlation between it? You just brought it out in such clear fashion, it makes sense. But why aren't we then pushing back, those of us that oppose it?
Well, first of all, we got to this point because education in the United States is lousy. There are some bright spots, but for the most part, they are not teaching about these things because, let's face it, Marxist theory and critical theory is rampant through the educational system, through the administrators and many of the professors and the teachers, and even the teachers union and the education boards. They are trying to get this indoctrinated because they're all working toward a utopia through human means. All it takes is a short examination of maybe, let's say 3 hours to understand what's going on here. So we're not very educated on that end. Number two, you have a bunch of people who they're too busy making their way in the earth, either as the business owners or the workers, to care about this. So the full-time professional Marxist socialists are actually way ahead of us because they're supported by outside groups in order to be activists, community activists, social justice warriors, etc. So they're very effective at pushing their agenda forward. And frankly, number three, because the church is woefully ignorant of the Bible and how to apply the Bible to culture, all of a sudden you've got, wait a minute. We've actually got Marxist ideas popping up in our seminaries and Marxist ideas that are being preached from our pulpit. In fact, there's a whole branch of theology called Black Liberation Theology, which is completely Marxist.
And that comes out of South America, right?
It does. It was a blend between the Marxist movements in South America and the Catholic Church. And who are the oppressors? The white. Who are the oppressed? The blacks. So if we just put it in religious terms, we'll raise up the black race, we'll push down the white race, and now it's not necessarily a sin. To them, the sin is racial differences, discrimination, whether real or perceived. So basically what they do under Marxism and the critical race theory or critical theory, they find a target, they freeze it, they put it against another target, and all of a sudden you create a clash between the two. By the way, that's Alinsky, Saul Alinsky's rule for radicals. You select a target, you freeze it, you demonize it, and then you attack it. That's the aggressive side of Marxism.
Now, I don't want to get controversial here, but I was reading something, actually I saw an expose as well on TV about George Floyd, and that issue between black and white, as you're saying, was an example of what happened everywhere in the world. I mean, how does a Minneapolis black man and his unfortunate death create worldwide pandemonium?
Because you have basically been working over the past 60, 70 years for a Marxist revolution around the world, particularly in the West, with the goal of bringing down Western civilization and instituting a socialist Marxist society around the world.
Well, we're just going to have to grab a cup of coffee and we'll continue this because it is so interesting.
I'm going to show you when you get back, and it better be a triple espresso, how this has worked its way into all sorts of things. We'll talk about groups and we'll talk about Jesus and how he solves this.
Hello, I am Maurice. I am the host here at the Here's That's Coffee Shop. I greet you, and I seat you, and I treat you to an excellent cup, a steamy cup of God's truth for the average Joe. You can find us at truthbarista.com or highbeamministry.com. That's high beams, as in car high beams. highbeamministry.com.
Truth Barista, every week we talk about things that are so important, but we want our audience to know that, there's a cost to this stuff. Your education, your time that you develop around a theme and you help people understand it at a deeper level. I mean, we really would like people to like us on Facebook. We'd like people to further our conversations through their social media, and we also want them to help support us.
High Beam Ministry has a lot to offer all sorts of people. Just go to the website, highbeamministry.com, and we've got the podcast, but we also have resources like some Bible study notes we're producing on the book of Daniel and the feasts of the Lord. We also have tremendous blog articles that we share and all sorts of additional resources for people. In fact, we have a page for news and great articles that are out there that people would find of interest, current events that relate to the Bible.
So where do people go to get more information on how to give and how to find more articles and more podcasts.
Go to High Beam Ministry, as in car high beams, highbeamministry.com. Look for the donate button on the webpage. If you want to contact us through email, it's highbeamministry@gmail.com. All one word, highbeamministry@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love your suggestions. We'd love your comments. We'd really, though, also love to have you support us.
Okay, Truth Barista, I mean, you are just taking us to the kind of the school woodshed. None of us have really been informed on most of this stuff, and I really want you to get to some of these organizations because I have signs of these organizations throughout my community, and every time I look at them, I go, that's a socialist group.
Okay, let's get into it.
Okay.
Let's talk about critical theory, and here's Marx in critical theory. Remember, and this is the key to identifying it is oppressed versus oppressor. You have to have somebody in control who's oppressing somebody else so that the Lone Rangers of Marxism can jump in and deliver you, but they're actually in it to gain power for themselves and wind up putting the oppressed down anyway. Sexuality. Here's the one. The straight person is the oppressor. The LGBTQ and multiple fluid gender people are the oppressed. Therefore, straight culture must be conquered and dominated, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, okay? Gender. Men are the oppressors. Women are the oppressed. Therefore, anything male or masculine must be conquered and dominated. Now, I want you to understand, as I'm going through this, I am not saying the epitome of life on earth are, at this point, straight men. I'm just saying as these are the targets that are being created. If you're male, if you're straight, you should be loving like Jesus loved, and you shouldn't be trying to oppress people. This is how it's being framed by the critical theorists, the Marxists in sheep's clothing, so to speak.
But the oppressor is sin.
Exactly. Being an oppressor is sin.
I mean, just sin itself is an oppressor.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
And therefore, if you ignore and eliminate the word sin or the concept, then we get back to this.
It's fascinating, too, that the devil is the author of sin, and his job is to oppress the human race. So, in essence, this is quite a ploy on Satan's part, is to take his own methods, project it into humanity. Humanity picks it up and is doing the exact same thing he does, getting back into oppressing other people, which we shouldn't. Jesus says, no, you were all designed to work shoulder to shoulder. And he says, as we'll say later, submit yourselves one to another. Cooperate. You wouldn't need these groups if we would cooperate together and look at life the way Jesus does. But since this is not based on God and out of human intellect and reasoning and the drive for power, you create these groups that are against straights, but pro-LGBTQ and anything else under the sun, that are against men as the oppressors and pro-women as the oppressed. That's the feminist movement right there. You know, the straight LGBT versus LGBTQ. You see that all over the place. The gay rights movement, okay? Here's the big one, race. Okay, let me quiz for Amazing Larry. Just from what you've seen in the last 6 months and the riots going, who are being framed as the oppressors?
Well, I would think that white people or white cops.
Okay, we'll take cops out of that because that's a function, okay? The white race, okay?
Right race, yep.
Okay, who are the oppressed?
Well, it's anybody who, as you mentioned, it's the minorities, marginalized.
Just relative to race. You have the white race, which are the oppressors.
Okay.
And those who are non-white, or as they say, people of color, are the oppressed. Do you see how unfair that is? Because even white people have various shades of color in their skin. And you're going, this has become a construct of the socialist Marxists in order to create division within society, because where there's division, a kingdom will not stand, because their goal is to bring down Western civilization and build their own kingdom, their own utopia, their own way.
Black Lives Matter.
Ooh, you hit it.
Has on the surface, it's all about black people and the oppression of the black race. However, once you start digging past the surface, you see that there's the gay issue, there's a transgender issue. I mean, every issue under the sun where somebody has been oppressed is in Black Lives Matter.
I have a screenshot of their About Us page, which they've changed since then. They are anti-family, they are anti-straight, they are anti-white, they are pro-everybody else, they're pro-whatever gender fluidity humanity. They want to see the nuclear family destroyed. They are, and by the way, that was the group I was referring to. They started as professed Marxists. That's the root of the organization. Their job is not to just lift up black people and Black Lives Matter, which, hey, I'm all for. Let's bring all the communities up. All lives matter. Let's all work together. Their job is to use race to push the Marxist ideals to overthrow what they see as a society they don't like, a capitalist society, and bring in Marxism.
And we've talked about this before, but the founders have a very strong spiritualistic background. So
Right. They're very occultic.
That's right. They talk to voices and voices talk to them, and that just doesn't sound kosher.
Yeah, they even had a YouTube video out there where the founders were showing the occult rituals that they go through to gain power. So again, this is all about the lens of power. So anything reflective of so-called whiteness, and they usually attach a pejorative to it like white nationalism or white supremacy, is designed to create a shame-based renunciation by their targets. So in other words, you get a bunch of Black Lives Matter people who are out there, and it's both whites and blacks, and they'll shake their finger, stick their finger in somebody's face and say Black Lives Matter. What they're doing is they're pushing power to get somebody else to declare their allegiance to their movement. That's all it is. It's a Marxist movement. Here's another one. Class. That's still being used today. Owners versus workers. So we have to get rid of all the haves. They must be conquered and dominated and forced to give their material goods to the have-nots. However, there are some haves that, really are, useful idiots, as Lenin said, and they're being used by these organizations in order to fund them. You're useful to us as long as you've got something we can use. Another thing is some of these rich haves are also leftists, and they want to see the system brought down. So they're willingly going along with this in order to position themselves for greater benefit in the long term and greater control, such as the big tech owners are doing this type of thing. And some company, many multinationals. Why? Because, here it is. We're just basically replacing the oppressors at the top with other oppressors, and everybody else are just useful to us. It's all about power. It's so hypocritical. Religion. Christianity and its followers are the oppressors, and any other religion or non-religion, atheism or agnosticism, are the oppressed. Therefore, anything smacking of Christianity is to be attacked, renounced, conquered, and dominated in favor of anything but the Judeo-Christian God, which ultimately tells you the spiritual root of Marxism and Marxist ideas. And by the way, this can be applied to any category that the cultural Marxists can dream up to create an oppressed versus oppressor tension and conflict. That's really the goal. We are going to create a dichotomy, set the parties against each other, and while we stand on the outside, and then we're going to jump in, pick up the debris, and remake society in our own image. Because the state is God, and the Marxists are gods of this material world. That's where this comes from. And this is why when you see Christians getting into this oppressed-oppressor thing, and buying into this stuff, you go, you do realize the spiritual root that you're joining here.
Now, when you say the spiritual root, as you've been explaining, does it not boil down to Satan himself?
Absolutely.
Because the power he wanted was worship. That was the very beginning. I can be just like God. He wanted the worship.
Think about this. God is in absolute control of both the spiritual and the material world.
Correct.
Okay. Satan wanted to be like God. He can't be king over the spiritual world, although it does indicate in Scripture he tried. Well, how can a created being go up against a creator? Impossible. But he could attack humanity and dethrone humanity, which had the leadership and the rulership over the material world. So if he could get rulership over humanity, then he could be top dog over this material world, and then he would continue to pit humanity against itself, which is the subdue and rule moved into conquer and dominate, in an effort to keep humanity weak and him in control. And then because of his influence, now you have humanity, such as the Marxes, the Lenins, the Chairman Maos, and Pol Pot dictators, Hitler, others. Doesn't matter if you're a fascist on the left, or you're a socialist on the left, or you're any kind of a dictator that's using power in order to control other people, it's sin. In fact, Saul Alinsky's book, Rule for Radicals, is dedicated to Lucifer.
I heard that.
And that is being embraced by the left, the socialist Marxists of our day, in order to conquer and dominate society and set up their own Eden in their own humanistic image.
Wow.
Okay, so let's get some good news going, okay?
Okay.
So the whole thing is about conquer and dominate, to divide and conquer. That's Marxism. Okay, what does Jesus want? Jesus wants us to subdue and rule the world, but the starting place is ourselves. We are the ones that we are to subdue and rule because we're out of hand. Problem is we can't do it ourselves because our heart is bent. So under the new covenant, Jesus said, I'm going to take out, well, actually the prophet said, but Jesus said he's bringing in the new covenant. The prophet said, God is going to take out our heart of stone, an unresponsive heart. He's going to give us a heart of flesh, a responsive heart. He's going to internalize his word in us, and that's going to be the way to do things. And he's going to come into us via his Holy Spirit. In other words, we have everything we need to begin to live God's way. And Jesus said, that's the only thing that will change you. This is something that mankind cannot do. It is something that is both spiritual and material. It's the spiritual at work within the material world, our being. And once that happens, Jesus says, great, now master yourselves. Then, as everybody is learning how to master themselves, which we would call disciples in a congregation or in a community of believers, now you work side by side to work on the world around you cooperatively. And by the way, don't infringe on anybody else's world. Submit yourselves one to another. Love one another. Don't stomp on one another. I mean, you want to talk about a truly utopian world? That's what Jesus is bringing mankind back to. And there is coming a day when he'll return. Everything is made right. And we will have that in both the spiritual and material world. You're just like stunned.
Well, it's such a nice conclusion to everything because it now makes sense. You're dealing with truth now as opposed to falsehood.
Right. So in the Bible, God is no respecter of persons. All people stand equal before him, and his measure of equality has nothing to do with the material world. His measure of equality is what have you done for him? How have you done it for him? What are your motivations? And every person is judged fairly and accurately before him, no matter if you're a superstar businessman or if you're just really good at pipe fitting. His measure is, have you been faithful? That's something that we can all be equal before God. We can all be faithful to him. His rules of right and wrong stand completely opposite of the rules of right and wrong concocted by the Marxists and the critical theory Marxists. His determination of what's equal is not the outcome, as I said, but in the creation of who you are as a person. That's what we should be working on, as opposed to means of production and the material world. We need to take control of ourselves. The assumption of privilege that we see today is grossly unfair. You know, you hear a lot about white privilege, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, that is a Marxist mean to create a target. It is grossly unfair, and by the way, it's racist.
It is racist.
Because it declares all white people as having privilege. So that is now an inherent fault within every white person. Racism is saying one race is either superior or inferior to any other race. White supremacy, that accusation, is actually a racist comment. And I can't be more clear about that. It's also been created as a bludgeon against anybody who doesn't line up with your particular point of view as far as race relations go. Are race relations perfect? Of course not. Because it's people. We need to work on people respecting people, irrespective of their look, you know, whether they have a big nose or a bald head or glasses. And no, you don't have a big nose. I'm just kidding.
I thought you were describing me for a moment.
No. I was thinking somebody entirely different. Wow, is that the time? Wow, I need to get going here. Okay. Just kidding. Okay, so really, our allegiance belongs to God. The Marxists want us to declare allegiance to the state. Our allegiance belongs to Jesus. Black Lives Matters and these other groups want to declare allegiance to their movement. This is why, as a Christian, you cannot bend the knee to these socialist Marxist groups, because you already have one who has your allegiance. Now, there is coming a time when somebody will stand up and say, you must bend the knee to me or die.
Mm-hmm. That's the Antichrist.
That's the Antichrist. That's the epitome of what prophecy says is coming. But we already have that in the world today. Mm-hmm. You bend the knee to the state or you die. You bend the knee to a religion or you die. Or you bend the knee to a liberal philosophy or we'll cancel you. Or you bend the knee to this or we'll make sure you never work in this town again. This is all cut from the same cloth of being, isn't it interesting, the oppressed, now becoming the oppressors and the oppressors now becoming the oppressed. You see, it only matters if you're the oppressed. But once you become the oppressors, doesn't matter anymore because we've made things right. The whole thing about the race baiters out there. Notice these guys are raking in the bucks. And how are they doing it? Setting people against each other racially. They're playing off of this entitlement. They're playing off of this, you're owed things. You're entitled. You've been victimized. You hear those words?
All the
you
time.
are hearing Marxist philosophy right there. The easiest way to get through all of this is, first of all, you do need to learn about Marxism and socialism, what it is basically. You definitely need to know your Bible. You need to be able to compare the two, and you need to be able to stand up for what is right, because we as the church need to set the bar as far as how people should deal with the issues in our day according to God and not according to a proven false humanistic philosophy that has brought death and destruction to untold hundreds of millions around the world. That is what is going to make the world better if and only if we do it God's way.
Truth Barista, thank you for calling our attention to this. Thank you.
This is Jay, your Truth Barista. Thanks for listening to the Truth Barista podcast. The best way to find out when a new podcast drops is through RSS feed. Go to our website, look for the RSS button, press it, and then enter your email. You'll be notified when a new podcast drops. Thanks for listening.